Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining this Digital Ship Media webinar presented by Insight and SmartSea. We're here today to discuss the lessons that the maritime industry, and particularly the cruise and ferry industry, can learn from the aviation sector. And maritime has a very, very long history of being compared to the aviation sector, particularly on things like safety, on things like standardization of equipment, and of course, most recently on areas like digital transformation. But actually, really getting to the core of what lessons the maritime industry can learn and what applies requires us to bring together a group of experts who have the right knowledge across both aviation and maritime. And so I'm delighted today to be introducing our panel of speakers. We're going to dive straight into the discussion. And so what I'd like to do is just start by, rather than me introduce them, I'll ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves. Just tell us who you are and a little bit about your background that brings you to the table to have this discussion. Chris, let's start with you.
Thanks, Nick. And good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. My name is Chris Vedat. I'm the CEO of SmartSea. I've been in maritime for around 25 years, which is probably showing my age now, and holding various technology roles during my career. Previously I was the CTO of P&O, and prior to that I was at a company called Topaz Energy Marine and Offshore, and prior to that I was a United Arab shipping company. So I've had a career spanning container, offshore, ferry, cruise, and now in SmartSea we're providing services, products and solutions to the maritime market as a whole, empowered by aviation technology.
Fantastic, Chris, and we'll definitely come back to why you're choosing to do something powered by aviation technology. I think that's really important. Next, Stephen.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Great to be here and thank you for joining us. Steve Hemmings, Client CTO for Insight. So Insight has a dedicated maritime team based here in EMEA. My responsibility is to set the strategic approach to which we bring digital transformation and our expertise to the maritime sector in partnership with Chris and SmartSea. Great to be here.
Thanks, Steve. Benoit?
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for being here. I'm Benoit. I'm maybe the aviation guy in the room. I'm a business development director for SITA. And I've been looking at technology, how to improve customer experience, operations efficiency, and how to leverage data. I'm one of the founding members of SmartSea.
Fantastic. Great to have your expertise here in the room, Benoit. And last but by no means least, providing the industry view, Jörg.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jörg. I'm the Senior Director Operations for Cruise Port Hamburg, which is the cruise terminal operator at the Port of Hamburg. And I'm also glad to be part of this webinar, and thanks for the invitation.
Fantastic to have you here, Jörg. I'm going to start with you, if I may. I'd just love to know, based on what you've seen over the last decade or so in Hamburg, how passenger expectations have been changed by what has happened in the aviation sector. Are you seeing that passengers are demanding kind of more of an aviation-like experience in the cruise terminal?
Yeah, we definitely see that this expectation is growing more and more. So the cruise business used to be a bit old-fashioned in the past and a bit more analog than maybe other modes of transportation are. But we do see now that lots of the cruise lines are catching up with introducing more and more digital processes in their terminal operations, but also in their onboard operations. And on the other hand, of course, we see more and more younger travelers coming on board the ships. So more people that are used to using their smartphone for paying, for traveling, whatsoever. So yeah, we definitely see an increase in that. And of course, as terminal operator and also with our cruise line customers, we try to prepare to meet that demand.
Just on that point, you mentioned that the things have been old-fashioned and analog, and I think that comparison between maritime and aviation is a common one, of people thinking of maritime as the old-fashioned and analog side. Chris, coming to you, there's a kind of perception that maritime is fundamentally different, and so the comparison between maritime and aviation, which gets made all the time, actually doesn't land. I'm just curious, sort of, what's your view on that?
I think historically we've used the excuse that they're so different, but they're actually not. They're quite similar. If you look at both the verticals, they're in the business of using assets to move people and goods. And that is ultimately where the comparative is. I mean, but the difference is that the aviation industry has just done that more efficiently and better, ultimately because they've had to. Now we could argue that the reason why that is because commercial aviation is around 75 years old, where if we look at commercial shipping, it's centuries old. But I think we need to stop using that excuse. I think we need to look at other verticals, aviation being one of them, but not the only one, and learn from that. It is widely accepted that the maritime industry is probably between 10 to 15 years behind aviation. So why not look at other verticals, not having to reinvent the wheel, and use those learnings to try and improve our day-to-day operations? I think that's what we're trying to do at SmartSea for sure, is to try and look at what aviation-powered technology can do for maritime. Yes, we need to maybe start slightly modifying that for maritime purposes, but we're not having to reinvent the wheel. And we really need to stop using these excuses and start embracing and looking towards the other verticals rather than saying, no, it's different, so let's not bother. Because I think if we take that mentality and approach, we will continue to only progress at a certain pace, and we really need to progress further. And there's no reason why we can't leapfrog other industries as well. I'd love to see maritime become the North Star in logistics versus being a lagger. For me, that would be the ultimate aim. And I think we need to start looking at some of the basic fundamentals and foundational stuff that we need to put in place in order to do that. I think the reason why, for example, aviation has prospered quicker from a digital perspective and is able to adapt and adopt new technologies quicker is because they put in place standards very early on in the cycle. Maritime doesn't have that, which means every time that we try to embrace new technologies, it's a harder implementation cycle.
Yeah, Chris, if I can touch on that as well, and I think it's really interesting the way that you approach it. So, from our perspective looking in, I think there's this element of change management that needs to be thoroughly considered, right? You've spoken before around this traditional, expectation from the passenger perspective, but then that's also existing within operations as well, right? And that's very clear to see. So as we're going on this journey, this change management approach that we bring has got to be with thought leaders like yourself, Chris, and Benoit and others. But then, of course, obviously reflecting on how people are going to be judged and want to be judged by the change in which, needs to happen over what period. And some of this stuff will be difficult. But again, I think you're absolutely right when you say that there are lessons that can be learned, and those lessons are accelerators, which will take away a lot of the immediate pain points or hesitations that you would normally have if you're going on this without knowing, how to do it and what to do, for example.
Thanks, Steve. I think, when I explain the analogies, I like to think of aviation as constantly looking at improving passenger experience, bringing operations efficiencies, and looking at data as an asset to link the two. And I think maritime is no different, provided we can actually learn from it, learn from aviation. It's not about doing a complete duplicate of the environment, but assembling the right technology as opposed to really doing a copy-paste. And with the right technology and the learnings and the ambition, if we get practical, then we can leapfrog.
Can I ask, actually, you're go on. I can see you want to say something.
I just wanted to add that we have to bear in mind that with many cruises all over the world, they are linked to an airlift transportation that is prior or after the cruise. So that especially shows us on how the passenger is already deeply involved in the aviation process. And thus it makes much more sense to also just run out that process through the cruise check-in experience or the terminal experience.
That's super interesting. So you end up with a kind of single seamless experience for the passenger.
Yeah.
And I imagine also everyone gets a better operating picture of where everyone's at and what's actually happening. To make something like that a reality, Benoit, you said we shouldn't just copy and paste the aviation side. So what are the things that are actually copy and pasteable? What are the things that we do need to draw down? And where do we need kind of genuine new innovation here?
Yeah, I have not completely decomposed the approach. However, I think that there's, like Chris said, the maritime is very much similar to the aviation environment, because it's all about moving assets, the logistics aspects. Bags are a similar potential opportunities for improvements, backdrops, and interoperability. I think what I mean by copy and paste and taking the good learnings is bringing the mindset of constantly looking at the passenger experience in ports and leisure. That would be more the guest experience, and making sure that this experience can be constantly improved by keeping an eye on how you operate in a much more efficient manner. Um, it has taken, in many cases for aviation, up to 40, 50 years sometimes to work on the practical ways of bringing economies of scale where multiple airlines are able to share infrastructure at airports, where airports can be very efficient at serving multiple airlines. There is a strong mindset in aviation of bringing those economies of scale with shared infrastructure. And that's interoperability is absolutely equally important in ports and leisure, if I may, so that you're not building a dedicated solution for a dedicated cruise line or ferry operator. You start bringing these economies of scale. And for me, that's really a first area of focus.
Chris, Benoit talked about interoperability, and you've talked about standards and bringing standards in. So just kind of unpack what standards would do potentially for this sector to make this interoperability possible.
I think standards is a key prerequisite, right? It's foundational because it allows the exchange of information far easier between multiple parties, which is a starting point for everyone, right? So the maritime industry is an ecosystem and there are multiple parties in that process. If the ability to exchange data becomes far easier and standardized, so the various different software companies, for example, within that process actually have a standard to work from, the adoption of these technologies becomes far easier. And it's one less barrier to entry. And I think that's what we need to be very mindful of. There's always challenges to doing any digital implementation. Steve picked up on the change management aspect. Whenever we do any implementation of anything, there's a change management that's required. If we remove those barriers, those blockers one by one, and that's called it the standards that need to be in place in order to exchange data, that's one less barrier for every shipping company, every ship manager, owner, port operator, terminal operator to adopt those technologies. And I think that's when we look towards aviation because they thought of that early on. They realized that if we had this standard in place, then their ability to exchange information becomes far easier. That's why you can check in Heathrow, for example, end up in Bangkok, traversed over 3 different airlines, multiple airports, but your baggage will arrive where it needs to because that data exchange exists between all those various different airlines and airports seamlessly. And for me, that is a really key learning that we need to take in maritime is that if we really want to get on this digital journey, we really want to advance further, we need to do some of these foundational things first. Now, they're not as exciting as some of the disruptive technology that exists today. Don't get me wrong, and everyone will talk about AI and all of these really disruptive technologies that exist within the industry now. And they're great, and they're amazing technologies, and they will enable the maritime industry to move quicker than before. But if we don't get the foundations right first, we won't be able to adopt these technologies as seamlessly as others. And there's a danger that they won't be as beneficial as they could be. So we as an industry need to take that on board and accept that we may need to walk first before we can run.
Steve, I want to pick up with you on the practicalities of actually making a standard work because I know of a a shipping company, a client of ours that had, I think they had 5 different standard formats for noon reporting. And they
Yep.
said, this doesn't work. We need to get to one individual standard. And then I checked back with them 12 months later, and they now had 6 standards because they had the one standard that introduced plus the 5 they originally had. And I know you've got experience in standards from other sectors outside of the maritime industry. So what does it take to actually make a standard work in a sector?
I think there's 3 things. I think the first one is that you need buy-in and commitment towards this common goal that standard is what you need. Okay. And I think when you see Chris present at other events and there's other leading industry speakers that are pushing this sentiment of it's really important, I think that helps to gain momentum and people will eventually buy in. I think the second one is to understand what the requirement is for those standards. So you speak about that particular client, the difficulty there is probably there's too many requirements trying to do too many things, right? So we need to be really, really conscious of what is the immediate outcome that we want to achieve. And over a period of time, more standards will follow for different operation types and for different scenarios. But for each individual, what's that immediate requirement for? And what's that data? And then I think the third one is, the single source of data, which is a common problem across every organization that we work in. So Insight, across banking, finance, retail, manufacturing, every sector you can possibly imagine. Every single one of those clients has got a problem with data. No one really knows how to solve it, which is, probably what gets us the business that it does. But on that journey, it's around understanding, okay, I need to do something with my data as a part of this process. But ultimately, we know what we're going to centralize around and treat as single source of that data then moving forwards. And that's a journey that, takes a number of years to go on. This is not going to be a quick fix. So, as you mentioned, my background in standards was from central banking. And I can promise you this, like trying to get 12, 15 different central banks to agree on particular types of data standards is not easy, right? Because everyone's thinking about their local requirements as well as the ecosystems. So there is a journey to go on. And again, part of that is reflecting on what are you trying to achieve, and you have to make some falls on that, and sometimes you have to press hard and say, look, this is important for the outcome that we've all brought into. But it's that journey that you need to go on, and I think with different frameworks that Insight is bringing, because of how we consult and deliver, I think that will definitely start to help, because that's a level of maturity that I think otherwise probably hasn't been seen in the sector.
Chris, before I come to you, I just want to briefly come to Jorg just to get his reaction to that. And I guess really, Jorg, I'm thinking you've got 3 technologists here on the conversation, pushing the idea of moving to unified data standards, pushing the idea of moving to unified platforms. I want to get your take on what do you think is, if you look at the terminal sector as a whole, what are the things that really are kind of holding back the ability to bring this sort of stuff in?
Yeah. One aspect you should consider is that the cruise line sees the terminal not only as a terminal where passengers are moving through, but it's like the first touch that you have with your guests. So that's why cruise passengers often are called cruise guests and not passengers. So we are not a train station, but rather the hotel lobby where you walk in and where you check in. And this is like the first experience that you get from the product that you've bought. So it is more important to have a welcoming atmosphere and feeling rather than just have an efficient process where people are moved through like you would move goods. And this is probably one of the aspects why we haven't adopted all of these different ideas from the other sectors so far. One thing, of course, is we differently from an airport, we don't run 24/7 operations year round. I mean, if we are operating a cruise terminal, let's say like 150 to 200 days a year, that is heaps already. But all of these other days, it's just like a massive empty building. So of course, we try to make use of this building for other purposes. And therefore, of course, we do not want to install too many fixed infrastructure and hardware within the terminal building, because then we lose the flexibility of making use for it for trade shows, for hosting events and whatsoever. And this is, of course, also why we are a bit reluctant on investing in infrastructure and hardware on this part. One further aspect, I think, of course, is if you have a look at how the bookings from the cruise lines are and how long your contracts usually run. I mean, there is some marquee ports that are pretty sure, like we are in Hamburg. We've got bookings now until 2032. So we are pretty sure that the customers are going to come. But there's also smaller ports that are not really confident, or they just can't be sure that they do have a client in 3 years. And then, of course, investing heavily into hardware, into processes, without knowing whether your major customer that you are setting the process up with is still in your port in 2028, or whether he's then calling your neighboring port and you are there with all your investments. So this is maybe a structure that is kind of preventing us from being that far as the aviation industry is. I just wanted to make just one comment on what I said earlier. By saying old-fashioned, I didn't mean that there's no willingness to improve and to make the process more efficient and better. But we do see that, like 5 years ago, there have been many people with clipboards ticking off names off a list, whereas this in other sectors has already been done in a digital process. But I would say that the speed that we are catching up with is tremendous. So if we see the new terminals that are now developed, whether it's in Miami or elsewhere in the world, this is like a complete different setup that we are operating in now. And also the processes within the terminal, the cruise terminals are changing tremendously. So I think the speed is very fast, and we are good to have that in our mind and try where our position is in and how the process will change, and also for us as terminal operator, how our role could change within this scenario.
Thank you, Jörg. I think that's a really helpful articulation of kind of where the industry is at. And Benoit, I want to get your take on it, because what I kind of hear there is there's a need for flexibility in terms of how the space is used. And it's worth thinking about, Hamburg as a port, you've got the cruise terminal, but then it's also a mixed use port when you go outside of the terminal. And so there's layers and layers of flexibility required. And then there's also the passenger experience. I don't want to name names, but there are some airlines I've flown with where I've definitely felt like cargo, and somewhere it feels like you get really well looked after. So that kind of brings me to this kind of idea of platform thinking and being able to bring in lots of different products, lots of different tools, lots of different services around a common platform that allows for that flexibility. So could you just kind of explain what that means in practical terms from the kind of SITA point of view?
Well, I think, Jörg, you spoke a bit about this, and you want the flexibility in the infrastructure, pretty much like a Lego plate, and maybe part of the terminal is used in one way or another. The platform thinking is very much related to that Lego mindset and the ability to use interoperability and common data standards, common data sets to plug the building blocks, to plug the bricks, and make sure that you actually make it easy to bring on new cruise lines, new ferry operators onto a common platform that you can burst, and port and leisure is very seasonal as a market, so that you can adapt to a growing traffic, an extra number of brands that can join the platform thinking. And at the same time, maintain space for differentiation. Each of those cruise and ferry operators are actually very keen on making sure that they shine, that they create amazing experiences for their own guests, and they really want to maintain that competitive advantage and create unique experience. We are lucky, I think, as IT architects, Steve, Chris, myself, we are now living an amazing platform transformation with all these IT building blocks. We're able to bring that platform mindset into the new products and solutions that we are building. We can absolutely respect what ports and cruise companies have already invested into, so that we don't break what had been already been deployed, what's already been adopted. And we can actually bring that platform mindset into the way that we build practical approach, new projects, into making this very concrete. In my view, we talked a lot about standards. I don't think we're missing standards. Standards have been defined in one way or another. We're just missing the practicality and the mindset of stitching building blocks together to actually make those standards a bit more real. And I think that's where a platform comes into play.
Steve and Chris, can I get your take on your other point, which was around that kind of long-term view, maybe straightforward for Hamburg, who are looking out into the 2030s, but for those smaller ports that don't have that visibility, and I guess to give you a really direct challenge, this is all sounding quite expensive. So where's the kind of commercial payback if terminals are going to lay out this this investment? How does it actually come back to them?
Chris, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can go. So I think, look, yes, there is going to be an initial investment. Of course there is. But we can't shy away from investment making progress. At the end of the day, there are clear use cases in other industries where you adapt these technologies that you'll have an operational efficiency. And I think we have examples today where you're able to show that already. If, for example, let's go back to smaller port operators, if they wanted to have, let's take the subject of standards, their implementation cost overall for further subsequent solutions will be far less. And that's a factual matter, yeah? If we start looking at some of the infrastructure costs that are required, so, for example, we talked about the foundational stuff that's required. In order to adapt and adopt new technology, the foundations need to be correct as well. So, it's about building, sort of imagine a pyramid, and you've got your infrastructure foundations, your automation, then you've got your innovation at the top. You need to start that investment somewhere to be able to really take advantage of these technologies moving forward. So yeah, there is a level of investment, but we shouldn't fear that investment. I think that investment is a lot less than it used to be. For example, the ability to utilize solutions like cloud-based solutions, SaaS-based services, makes that moving from a CapEx to an OpEx model far easier. So those costs are far less. Using these platform services, for example, and that's something that SmartSea is looking to do as well, as we're trying to build something called SmartSea Vision, which is a maritime platform, a maritime marketplace, which allows the smaller operators, ports, terminals, ship owners, ship managers, to consume services without having to have that heavy CapEx investment early on, is a way forward. I think when we start looking at the advancements of some of these technologies from a communication perspective, that enables vessels, as an example, to be able to consume cloud-based services now better. Leo, things like Starlink coming into play now. Amazon's now going to be launching the new Leo services. Communications is far better, which also helps ports and terminals as well, for example. So it's not only the ships that will have improved communication links to be able to consume services. These more remote, smaller terminals and ports that maybe didn't have the infrastructure in place before can now take advantage of these technologies as well in order to consume services far easier. So I think, yes, there's a cost. Is that cost as much as it used to be? No. Should it be a barrier or a fear factor for people to invest? No, because I think the advantages outweigh the costs far more.
I do know of a container terminal that recently got started in a very remote location, and they were able to do it with a cloud-based terminal operating system, a Starlink connection, a Wi-Fi router, and 2 iPads, and that was all of the IT infrastructure required.
That's the disruptive technology in play now, right? I spent a lot of time in Africa, and I can tell you now the communications wasn't great there all the time. But now with Starlink in place, or LEO technologies, not just say Starlink, those barriers are far less now.
Steve, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I think Chris makes some excellent points. I think for us, some immediate observations that we're seeing is the shift to this OpEx type of model, right? So whether it's SaaS based or cloud, but also physical infrastructure itself doesn't need to be a CapEx investment anymore. There's different ways as well that you can position this investment. What's that return on investment, that business case, but also what revenue streams can it start to create for you? So that's again where you can start to become more disruptive. So local ports, for example, these smaller entities on the on the south coast of the UK, for example, we've got brilliant little ports that can do so much. my local port, for example, they've just built a Wi-Fi network with the local council, and now they're able to pop up, small entities and startups in that local container facility. Right, I know it's not necessarily maritime, but it's a way in which they've known they've needed to invest in connectivity. They've used it and then said, right, well, now we can create a revenue stream from it. So these are the things where you can start again thinking outside the box and using that investment to your advantage that can immediately play out. But it is always going to be disruptive. And I think it's about also, as we're going on this journey, just embracing that disruption and saying, look, it's be new, whatever we're going to, it's not going to be the same.
I want to come to the kind of practical reality of making some of this stuff happen. But before I do, I'd just like to say, if you're in the audience, we will come in about the next sort of 10 minutes or so, we will come to a session for audience Q&A. I can see actually lots of audience questions and comments already coming in, which is fantastic. So we will come to those in the next 10, 15 minutes. But what always happens with these sessions is we get too few questions right at the beginning, which doesn't seem to be the case today, but then not enough time to answer all the questions that flooded in the last 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to put a question to the panel, then please make it now using the Q&A function. Just type it out and send it over to us, and then we'll come to the questions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time that we've got. But do send them through. All right, let's talk about change management. Chris, I know this is a favorite topic of yours, and I think this is an area where, if I'm really honest, a lot of this stuff I think can feel quite ethereal if you're not an IT architect. If you are an end user of these sorts of systems, you're on the ground, either welcoming passengers in or helping to move bags through. Like, how do we actually go about helping people who are at the coalface, if you will, to be able to kind of change processes to enable this stuff to happen?
I think you picked up on a good point where he's saying that we really need to be mindful of what the environment we're going into, right? Like you said, the terminal isn't used all the time. It needs to be able to adapt and adopt when needed. And we must ensure that we're not implementing technology for the sake of implementing technology. It really has to have a value. And I think it's super important that when we're looking at what we're trying to implement into let's say, a cruise terminal, it's actually going to add value when it does. And it's that whole cycle of change management needs to be in place. What is the pain point? What are we trying to solve? being siloed ourselves. The maritime industry's siloed away from the other verticals, but even within maritime, we have our own silos, and we need to really break those silos down to ensure that we collaborate far more together. Yeah. Benoit mentioned the community that exists within aviation. We need to build upon that community that sits within maritime, not just within the cruise operators, but the cruise and the terminal operators as well. The class societies, all the various, the flag societies, all the various stakeholders involved in these processes need to have a more of a community approach and a collaborative approach, and look at ways that they can share data instead of it being, it's mine, I don't want to remove it. That share data. Then there's many ways that we can all compete, but there are certain things that we don't need to compete on. I think that's the mentality that we really need to drive through.
It's worth saying as well, it gets much cheaper for software vendors to engage with the market when you have standards like this in place. And I think there's still, I think a lot across a lot of the maritime industry. There's a kind of view from the software world that it's tough to integrate into this space, and it's going to cost us a lot of money, and therefore we just don't bother. And I think that opening up these standards and making them widely available actually makes it much easier for innovators to get into the market.
And more cost-effective solutions.
Yeah. All right. We've got loads of questions in, which is great. So I'm just going to start rattling through them and see where we end up. Steve, I'm going to send the first one your way, if that's all right.
Sure.
Aviation had organizations like IATA helping to drive common passenger standards, whereas maritime governance feels much more fragmented, and bodies like the IMO understandably have a much broader focus than just cruise and ferry. So given that, what do you see as the kind of low-hanging fruit the industry should realistically standardize first so that we can make a tangible difference?
Well, I think it's back to what Chris has just commented on, right? So where we've got these distinct different agencies or particular subsectors of maritime overall being able to interoperate, or how do we drive that collaboration? So today we've been focusing heavily on cruise and terminals, quite rightly, with York. So I think some of that low hanging fruit is understanding how we build that community, whether it's across the UK or across broader EMEA, where those thought leaders and those change agents can come together to say, right, what does a good standardization look like? Right? How can that be facilitated? And working on a journey from there. I think, some of that standardization is, to York's point, 3 or 4 very simple basic processes, right? But you set the guardrails, if you like, for we're only going to work on scenarios such as, those terminals that are used on a regular basis, or where we've got cruise liners that are coming in on a very regular basis. I think that's where we're going to be able to realize the economies of scale there.
Yeah, makes a huge amount of sense.
If I may, Nick, I would look into the passenger manifest and trying to really focus on the guest experience. I'm amazed by the fact that there are still quite a few number of property management systems and on ship dedicated ERP or systems that are dictating somehow the technical check-in on board those cruise ships, and not so much simplified ways of sharing some of the guest data, be it for preparing the ports for shore excursions, from home porting, from crossing the borders. I'm not sure yet if there has been an established way and good ways of sharing some of these passengers lists in the most efficient manner. I do believe that the safety and the security work is being done, but there's probably a lot of room for improvement to overall, create some elements of pre-clearance, some predictability around the process of disembarking and embarking, and some extra insights. I'm not talking about sharing everything we know about the passengers on board the ships to everyone, ports and destination, but at least a partial view to overall improve the quality of the ports, improve the port efficiencies among a community of interest. At the end of the day, I believe that the operators and the ports are actually both focused and taking care of the guest experience. and data exchange can be looked at in an open way.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes that makes a huge amount of sense. There's a couple of kind of similar questions I'm going to sort of group together, and Chris and Jorg, I'll sort of send them in your general direction. One is, before investing in shared digital infrastructure, where is the commercial return? Are there any examples you can share where interoperability has actually generated new revenue or reduced costs? And there's another similar one that's sort of picking on the commercial discussion and the payback. We all know the opportunities there, but when you talk to the maritime ecosystem, they're so content with the way they operate that making them go for that expense to change seems a bit tricky. So with this kind of concept of commercial payback, could we get specific here in terms of kind of either case studies or stories that you have of where this is genuinely paid back in real world dollars and cents? Chris, maybe from a kind of general industry point of view, and then Jorge, if you have any specific examples from the terminal, I'd love to hear them.
I mean, I think one really good example, which is industry relevant, certainly for maritime, is that in the liner industry, they standardized the exchange of data between the liner operators and the terminal operators. So, you had Kawari, Kadeko messages, which was standardized, and it's probably one of the only real standards that exist in maritime from the EDIFACT perspective, that allowed the ability to move containers seamlessly between the terminal operators and the container operators. And that's a very clear example of how the investment in those standards and that digital infrastructure had an operational value. And, I don't have the exact numbers and dollars and cents, but I can tell you now that I was part of it when I started very early on in my career, where we had things called T cards, which were post-it notes of the containers, and you were using white balls balls to track containers. And that was not efficient at all. We had a lot of people trying to do that. We moved into digitized container tracking, container control. And we had efficiencies from operational perspective and manpower perspective. And we had much greater insight into the operational value of what we were doing. So I think, look, some of these things have got tried and tested solutions in place, but we also need to be very mindful that, there is an element of, not risk is the wrong word, but we need to take a step forward, right? We can't rest on the point that, it's too expensive to do. I don't want to change the way we do things. Sorry, guys, that's not going to fly anymore. Let's look at things that are coming into place today. Regulation from sustainability and emissions tracking is forcing change from a digital perspective. We've got to embrace some of these technologies. Otherwise, we will not be able to compete moving forward. We can't be fearful of change. We can't be fearful of investment, because this will be forced upon the industry one way or another, right? Regulation itself will start to enforce things upon the industry. If we don't, drive the change ourselves, it'll be forced upon us. And I think that goes back also to the point we were talking about, standards. And I think the industry as a whole needs to take control of this and not wait for it to be dictated upon. Regulations like our IMO, for example, will get there, but they're quite slow. Whereas if the industry makes the changes and controls their own destiny, that's far better for the industry than having that dictated upon them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's actually a question or a comment that although slow, collaboration is best found at the IMO and industry associations and stakeholders. And I kind of view the IMO as a kind of long-term sweep to kind of raise the floor. But I think there's a huge gap between the ambition of the IMO and the ambition of the industry, and actually what the world and customers need as well. Jorg, we've got a few more minutes. I'd just love to hear some of the examples you have of improvements that have been made within kind of Cruisegate Hamburg.
I think it's the question raised is a very good one, because it leads us to the point of, is the one who's investing actually the one who's benefiting from it? And if I'm not doing the ground handling, but if I'm investing into a smart terminal infrastructure and thus reducing probably check-in stuff and hosty stuff by a smart gate, then the investment is on my side, but the reduction of stuff is rather on the cruise line side or on the ground handling operator side. So we need to transfer that into a mode where I don't know, I charge an infrastructure usage fee or whatsoever whenever the gate is used, and by that create a business model that will pay off for these investments. And I think this is like one of the points that is actually like kind of holding us back, or has been holding us back in the past, because the financial streams were just different. On the other, another example would be like if you have a efficient truck announcement process for delivery of goods for the cruise vessel, and by that you've got a very efficient and streamlined truck loading and unloading process. This might get you more attractive for the forwarding companies to deliver to your port, and by that you might attract more provisioning business, or you might get like the cruise lines might get a better rate for the delivery of goods, because the truck driver knows that he's been processed within 2 hours and not waiting 10 hours in the port. And by introducing this from a port operator side, you do not probably get a direct benefit, but you may be more attractive for your customers to come to your port. So my personal feeling is, in the past, you used to be front runner if you were doing this. In 10 years, it will be like toilets. If you don't have it, people are not going to come. I mean, I know people that are not shopping in a specific store if they can't pay with a smartphone. So they just go next doors. And my feeling is that we will be in that situation within the next 5 or 10 years. So if you do not provide a proper infrastructure that your passenger is used to from his other daily life, then you kind of get left behind.
Just one other audience question on that actually is one major difference I see from aviation is that airlines compete to get space at airports. This is not the case when it comes to the relationship between cruise and cruise terminal. But if I'm understanding your point correctly there, you're essentially saying it's the cruise terminal's responsibility to compete to get the cruise ship in, and the cruise ship has options. And therefore, if you don't bring these systems in, you'll get left behind.
Well, in the past, of course, it was more on the other side, that business, but with vessels getting bigger and bigger, and the availability of berth for big vessels getting less, we do see that it's rather more a situation where the cruise lines are pushing and leading us to longer term commitment, which of course is a good situation for us as cruise ports. But still, we are in a competitive environment where we've got a lot of ports neighboring, pretty much delivering the same service from a terminal perspective. Of course, in Hamburg, we are in the lucky position that we've got a beautiful city that makes us a marquee port where everybody wants to go to. So this is, of course, a comfortable share I'm sitting in with regard to that point. But yeah, still, I think you will have to make sure that you are competitive as a destination, because this is what overall leads to a good guest certification rating, and that's what the cruise lines are seeking for.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. Unfortunately, we are rapidly running out of time. Although I feel like we could have gone on for hours on this topic. What I'd like to do is, as a kind of a way of wrapping up, would be to ask each of you if a member of the audience is sat here kind of scratching their head thinking, okay, well, this is all very helpful and I'm excited about it, but what do I do next? What's sort of one piece of advice that you would suggest that they take back to their organizations once they finish this session? Chris, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I look, one piece of advice: be open-minded. Don't be fearful of change. Don't be fearful of other industries. I think you need to be open-minded and be willing to change.
Love it. Steve?
Yeah, I think it's that bravery and knowing that, yes, the risk, but this needs to happen to the sector anyway. And I think you also just made a really interesting point about the competitive nature. And I know we're only focusing on one part of maritime today, but that market is going to become more and more competitive. So you are eventually going to be forced into doing it if you want to remain competitive.
Yeah, makes a huge amount of sense. Benoit?
Yeah, don't look at these opportunities as being complex IT projects or infrastructure projects. Think at this as a foundational, bring the mindset, which is what I call sometimes the platform mindset. So that goes with the open mind. And start small, move little by little with a very practical approach as well.
Yep, makes sense. And last but by no means least, Jörg.
Yeah, I fully agree with Chris. Be open-minded for change. Do not fear the processes because you're not going to prevent them. They are going to come. And I would suggest talk to your customers, talk to the cruise lines or ferry lines, whoever is your customer, on what their needs are and try to develop in a joint approach.
Right. It's on me to bring this to some level of conclusion then. I think even if your city is as lovely as Hamburg is, the competitive dynamics of the market mean that it's important to stay ahead of this stuff. And I think the way to do that is actually to start small, as Benoit said. It's not about trying to boil the ocean. It's about looking for those kind of really core processes. Benoit mentioned the passenger manifest. I think it's a great place to start, but those core processes that will really move the needle in terms of experience or move the needle in terms of commercial opportunity for the terminal or for the cruise operator or passenger ferry operator, and start there with a small number of stakeholders as well, and then start to work outwards once you start to get some level of success. And then constantly focus on the change management aspects. People fear change naturally. And as Chris says, it's important not to fear change, but that can be easier said than done. So constantly communicating with all of your stakeholders, all of your team, to show them what becomes possible when you start to embrace this stuff. And then look out at the wider ecosystem and look at where those areas are where we can have those common standards that enable those platforms that I think ultimately build a much more prosperous ecosystem. Thank you all so much. Steve, Chris, and Benoit, thank you so much for fascinating and really insightful discussion. Thank you to everyone in the audience for listening in, and particular thanks to those of you who contributed questions and comments. Sorry we didn't get time to get to all of them. And lastly, thanks to the teams at Insight and SmartSea for actually making this whole thing possible. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and thanks again for joining. Cheers.
Thank you all. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Cheers, Nick. Thanks, Nick.